Chapter 38 England's Greatest Queen. The Queen Who Almost Wasn't. Do you remember Henry VIII, the English king who had 6 wives? He kept getting married because he wanted to have a son, and then, when his third wife, Jane Seymour, finally gave birth to a baby boy, he hoped for another one. Back in the early days of the Renaissance, people often died of illnesses that wouldn't really be very serious today. So Henry VIII wanted another son in case anything happened to his oldest boy, little Prince Edward. But Henry VIII never had another son. When he died, Prince Edward became King Edward VI of England. Edward was only 9 years old, so his uncles helped rule England for him. And Edward wasn't in very good health. He kept coughing, and he was very thin. As Edward got older, he became even weaker. By the time he was 16, he was forced to stay in bed. Physicians tried every cure they knew. One cure was to put leeches on the young king to suck out some of his blood. Another was to have him swallow a live spider covered in molasses. But none of these cures worked. Soon everyone knew that the king was dying. But who would rule England next? Edward had no brothers, only 2 sisters. Mary, the oldest sister, was the daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine, the Princess of Aragon. Elizabeth, the younger sister, was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, who had been beheaded. Even though England had never had a woman on the throne before, one of these 2 sisters would have to become queen. Their followers argued over who should have the throne. Mary's powerful supporters won the argument. In 1553, Mary was declared the first Queen of England. She rode through the streets of London to the Tower of London to be crowned, and her little sister Elizabeth knelt down and promised to be faithful to the new queen. Elizabeth was very careful to say only kind things about her sister. In public, Elizabeth acted humble and loving to Mary, but the truth was that Elizabeth was frightened. She and Mary had never been good friends. Mary had been declared Princess of Wales, heir to the English throne, when she was born. Until she was a teenager, Mary had been treated like a queen in waiting. She had her own coat of arms, her own private apartments, and 160 servants to wait on her. She traveled in a velvet litter carried by servants, and ate her meals beneath a special canopy that showed how important she was. Everywhere she went, people bowed to her and called her princess. But then her father, Henry VIII, married Anne Boleyn, and Elizabeth was born. The minute that Elizabeth drew her first breath, a herald announced to all the people that Elizabeth, not Mary, was now Princess of Wales and heir to the throne. Henry VIII ordered Mary's coat of arms to be stripped from all her clothes and given to Elizabeth. He sent all of her servants away and told Mary that she had to be her little sister's maid of honor. Now the baby Elizabeth was carried around on the velvet litter. Mary had to ride or walk behind her. Elizabeth was given the household of servants, the special place to eat, and beautiful clothes made out of satin and silk. Mary had to eat down at the foot of the table and live in an uncomfortable room in the palace. How do you think Mary felt about Elizabeth then? It would be hard to love your little sister if your parents took everything that belonged to you and gave it to her, and then told you that you had to be her servant. Mary refused to admit that Elizabeth was now the princess. "That is the title that belongs only to me," she told her father, but he ordered her to accept her new place. Elizabeth was the Princess of Wales. Mary was just a lady in waiting. But exactly the same thing happened to Elizabeth only a few years later. When Elizabeth was 4 years old, little Prince Edward was born. Immediately, the herald announced that Edward, not Elizabeth, was now the heir to her throne. Henry took away Elizabeth's coat of arms, her servants, her velvet litter, and her special place to eat. She was sent to live in a house away from the castle. Her governess wrote a letter to the palace, complaining that the little girl hadn't been given enough money to live on. "She doesn't even have a decent nightgown or handkerchiefs," the governess objected. Now that Elizabeth and Mary had both lost their positions as princesses, Mary was kinder to her little sister. But she never forgot how Elizabeth had taken her place. When she became queen, she passed a law saying that Elizabeth had never really been the Princess of Wales. Then she accused Elizabeth of plotting against her. She ordered her sister imprisoned in the Tower of London. When the soldiers came to arrest Elizabeth and take her away, Elizabeth was afraid that she would be killed. She cried out, "Give me a minute to write my sister a letter." And then she scrawled on a piece of paper, "I never talked or thought about any such thing as taking your throne away. May I die a shameful death if I did such a thing. Do not condemn me." But Mary refused to even read the letter. Elizabeth spent months in the Tower of London, expecting every morning that soldiers would drag her away and behead her. Mary couldn't find any evidence that Elizabeth had plotted against her, though, so finally Mary let her sister go and live in a small, dingy house in the country. Here Elizabeth was surrounded by servants chosen by Mary, and by soldiers who searched her house constantly for any signs of treason. She wasn't even allowed to go for a walk without special permission from Mary. 4 years after Elizabeth's arrest, she was sitting under a tree reading the Bible in Greek. A soldier nearby watched her every move. She heard galloping hooves and lifted her head to watch the road. A messenger came into sight, wearing the royal colors. Was he coming to tell her jailers that Mary had finally condemned her to death? Elizabeth stood up and watched the man dismount from his horse, but instead of speaking to the soldier behind her, the messenger fell on his knees in front of Elizabeth. "Mary, Queen of England, is dead," he said. "You are now Queen of England. God save the Queen." Good Queen Bess. Elizabeth was now Queen of England. When the people of England heard that Mary was dead, they sang and danced in the streets. Mary had been very unpopular as queen. Mary wanted to bring England back to the Catholic faith that her father, Henry, had rejected, so he had sent men throughout England demanding that her people swear allegiance to the Catholic Church. 300 men and women who refused were burned at the stake. Mary's subjects had begun to call her Bloody Mary because of her cruelty. So when Elizabeth rode into London with 1,000 men behind her, the streets were lined with cheering people. Elizabeth arrived at the castle and took charge of it. She replaced all of Mary's servants and ladies-in-waiting with her own, and fired most of Mary's advisers. And she planned a great ceremony in which she would be crowned queen. When the day came, Elizabeth was carried to Westminster Abbey, London's most important church, on a litter covered with gold cloth. Her gown was also made of gold cloth. Over it she wore a velvet cape with ermine fur on its edges and a heavy necklace of rubies and pearls. A heavy gold crown was placed on her head. A minister put holy oil on her head, and she was given a scepter, a globe with a cross on it, called an orb, and a special ring to show her power. Elizabeth was now Elizabeth I, Queen of England. The year was 1558. Elizabeth I would remain on the throne of England for 45 years. These years became known as the Elizabethan Age. Under Elizabeth, England would become peaceful, rich, and more powerful than ever before. Elizabeth did not want to make the same mistakes that Mary had made. She wanted her people to love her, not loathe her. So although she announced that England would now be a Protestant country again, she did not force her people to swear that they were Protestants. No more Catholic church services were allowed, and Elizabeth wanted her advisers to be Protestants. But she didn't ask her subjects what they were doing in private. She told her advisers that she didn't intend to make windows into men's souls. This was an unusual attitude for a Renaissance ruler to take. Many other European rulers were busy making sure that all of their subjects swore allegiance to either the Catholic or Protestant faiths, but Elizabeth was more worried about whether or not her subjects were loyal to her. Elizabeth was also determined not to marry. Mary had married a Spanish prince who convinced her to send English soldiers to help with Spanish battles. The English didn't like this prince, whose name was Philip. They thought he was arrogant and selfish, and above all, a foreigner. They didn't want English soldiers to go fight in foreign wars, and when Philip started to help Mary make laws for England, many of Mary's people ran through the streets yelling, "We will have no foreigner for our king." All of Elizabeth's advisers expected her to get married as soon as possible. As a matter of fact, when Elizabeth called her first Parliament, the group of representatives who would help her to pass laws, Parliament told her, "We can't talk about laws until we've arranged a wedding for you." But Elizabeth knew that if she got married, her husband would be the real ruler of England. Back in those days, most people thought that men were always wiser, smarter, and stronger than women. If Elizabeth married a prince, more and more of her power would go to him. Elizabeth had no intention of giving up any of her power. Parliament insisted. They didn't think that a woman could do a job of ruling England. Mary certainly hadn't. Elizabeth needed a man to help her, and she needed to have children. What if she died without an heir? Who would be king after her? Philip, Mary's husband, offered to take on the job of marrying Elizabeth. He had enjoyed the power that came with the throne of England, and he wanted it back. Of course, he didn't say, "I want to marry Elizabeth so that I can be king of England again." He put it in much grander words. "I have decided," he wrote to Parliament, "to render this service to God, and offered to marry the Queen of England. It would be better for herself and for her kingdom if she would take a consort, a husband, who might relieve her of those labors which are only fit for men." But Elizabeth put her foot down. She took off the ring she had been given when she was crowned, and held it up in front of all those men. "Behold," she said, "the pledge of this, my wedlock and marriage with my kingdom. Every one of you, and as many as are Englishmen, are children and kinsmen to me." Elizabeth's words meant that she was married to England. She had no room for a husband. The job of being queen would take up all of her time. And Elizabeth did put all of her time into ruling England. She worked hard, making alliances with other countries, sending explorers out to claim undiscovered lands for England, and defending her land against invasion. 30 years after she became queen, Elizabeth encouraged her soldiers before a battle by shouting out, "I am resolved in the midst and heat of the battle to live and die amongst you all, to lay down for my God and for my kingdom and my people my honor and my blood, even in the dust. I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." Elizabeth was right. She was the best ruler England ever had. Her people loved her and gave her the nickname Good Queen Bess.